So Steve Silverman is the president of the Silverman Group, a consultancy that serves medical product companies and financial investors on regulatory, strategy, and policy issues. Steve also serves as an expert witness on medical product regulatory matters. Steve's professional experience includes nearly 2 decades in federal service with extensive time in senior FDA roles. At the FDA, Steve directed the Medical Device Center of Office of Compliance, where he led device quality initiatives, engaged Congress and the press, and guided the office's reorganization. Before joining the Device Center, Steve helped lead the FDA Center for Drugs Office of Compliance, where he focused on product approval and labeling. Steve joined the FDA as an associate chief counsel, where he led enforcement actions against drug and medical device companies. Steve's past work includes positions with the US Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. After leaving the FDA, Steve joined McKinsey & Company as a senior expert, where he counseled pharmaceutical, medical device, and other clients on regulatory strategies, product compliance and quality, and stakeholder communication. He later joined AdvaMed, the leading medical device trade association in the US, where he focused on product quality and compliance, pre-market approval, and device advertising and promotion. So thank you very much for joining us and doing the presentation today, Steve. We are very lucky to have you, and I will hand over to you to begin.
Thank you. I think first and most important, let me just check, how's the sound quality?
It sounds good to me.
Excellent. So please feel free to interrupt. If things deteriorate, you'll let me know and we'll try to make adjustments.
I will do.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I am Steve Silverman, and as Jamie mentioned, I am the president of the Silverman Group. And rather than kind of going through and repeating information that Jamie provided, why don't we just jump into the presentation? And Jamie, I'll ask you to take a look at the next, or to display the next slide. So here's an overview of today's presentation. And as you'll see, we're taking a top-down approach that starts with an overview of the US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, which includes its mission and jurisdiction. Much of that presentation is going to focus on FDA regulation of medical devices. That activity occurs within FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. And within CDRH, we're going to talk more specifically about the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, or OPEQ, OPEC. As you'll hear, OPEC is what's referred to as a quote-unquote super office. OPEC is responsible for reviewing the products that device makers sell. And so this includes devices before and after they come to market, which is referred to by the FDA as the total product life cycle. OPEC shares responsibility for overseeing devices on the market with the Office of Regulatory Affairs, or ORA. And this is a separate part of FDA. It's actually a component of the FDA Commissioner's Office, not the Center for Devices. Next, the presentation will detail what effective FDA engagement means. What kinds of engagement are we talking about? And what do we mean by effective? For example, I'll also talk about why effective FDA engagement matters, and perhaps more importantly, how to engage FDA effectively. Effective engagement is worthwhile and it's valuable, but achieving effective FDA engagement is sometimes challenging. At times, as you I'm sure know, engagement goes sideways. And I'll talk about some of those situations, what causes them, what to do when engagement goes off track, and the value of bringing more senior FDA staff into discussions. In particular, I'll focus on 2 scenarios. The first is regulatory correspondence, like FDA warning and untitled letters. The second is FDA civil enforcement action, specifically product seizures and injunctions. Next, we'll touch on some hot topics for medical devices, such as digital technology and real-world evidence. And last, but by no means least, I want to hear from all of you. I expect that many of you have engaged FDA, and I want to talk about whether your experiences align with my assessments and recommendations. And of course, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have. So why don't we move to the next slide? Let's talk about FDA's mission and jurisdiction. Mission is the statement of the FDA's main job, the primary activities that FDA is focused on every day. Jurisdiction is what FDA is authorized to do. So where does this authority come from? And the answer is the United States Congress. The Food and Drug Administration is a federal agency, so it doesn't have authority to create its own jurisdiction. Rather, the jurisdiction comes from Congress and defines what FDA may and may not do. So as you'll see, there's a close connection between FDA's mission, which FDA identifies and communicates, and its jurisdiction, which is authority that Congress provides. The agency's mission is to ensure the safety, efficacy, and security of medical devices, human and animal drugs, and biological products like vaccines. Let's go to the next slide. This is an overview of how FDA is organized, and there are some pieces that I want to point out here. The boxes at the bottom are relevant, especially the highlighted one. It shows the various FDA product centers as well as the Office of Regulatory Affairs. We are going to focus on the Center for Devices. That is the very poorly highlighted one in yellow. The bad art is my fault. As I mentioned a moment ago, ORA shares some device oversight responsibility with the Center for Devices, and so we'll talk about that as well. Let's just go to the next slide, please. Now let's drill down specifically on medical devices. As I said before, the part of FDA that is primarily responsible for medical device regulation is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. Like FDA generally, the Center for Devices has a mission to assure that devices are safe, effective, and high quality. High quality simply means that the devices are well made in compliance with manufacturer and quality regulations. In talking about FDA medical device regulation, it's important to understand what a device is. So this slide contains key parts of the formal medical device definition. What's worth highlighting is first and foremost, a device is a thing. So it can be a machine, an implant, and as we'll discuss later, even a digital tool. What's important is that this thing cures or prevents diseases without chemical action in the body. That kind of chemical action within the body characterizes drugs or biologics, not medical devices. So for example, a heart pacemaker, it's a device. It certainly operates within the body. As you know, it's implanted and it's connected to the heart, but it doesn't operate through chemical action within the body. Rather, it's, of course, battery powered. So let's go to the next slide. Here is the Center for Devices organizational chart, and we're going to focus in particular, as I mentioned a moment ago, on the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, OPEC. So what is OPEC and why does it matter? First, this office was formally launched about 3 years ago, and it was launched as a super office. That means it brings together and oversees a lot of organizations within the Device Center that used to exist as independent entities. Before OPEC was launched, for example, there was a separate standalone Office of Device Evaluation that was responsible for deciding which devices could come to market. There was also a separate standalone Office of Compliance, which was responsible for assuring that marketed devices met legal requirements like quality standards and advertising rules. Those standalone offices and others were merged into OPEC and no longer exist. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Here's a graphic that demonstrates how OPEC is organized. It's complicated, so welcome to US government organization. What you do need to pay attention to, I think, is the following. I would suggest focusing on the bottom row of boxes that are titled OHTs 1 through 7. OHT stands for Office of Health Technology. These are the OPEC components that are actually responsible for medical device evaluation and oversight. And as you'll see, they're broken out into product areas. For example, OHT2 focuses on cardiovascular devices, and OHT6 handles orthopedic devices. Just as a quick update, this chart shows 7 OHTs, but OPEC recently created a new OHT to handle radiological health products, which is OHT8. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk for a moment about the total product life cycle, or TPLC. First, what is it that I mean by total product life cycle? And here are a couple of points that are worth calling out. Most FDA medical product centers, like the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, are organized according to pre-market and post-market responsibilities. This means that different organizational components and different staff are responsible for deciding, first, whether a product comes to market, and second, once a product is on the market, whether it satisfies requirements for things like manufacturing and advertising. As a practical matter, this means different offices with different staff for pre-market and post-market activities. The Devices Center is different. It combines all these activities into a single office and integrates staff to work on them. For example, staff responsible for cardiovascular device oversight handles everything from pre-market review of the device to post-market oversight of manufacturing, advertising, and other requirements. The philosophy behind the total product lifecycle approach is that there's no value in segregating pre-market from post-market functions. Instead, these activities combine into a total product lifecycle, and the staff that evaluates and oversees medical devices follows this integrated lifecycle approach. What this means for you is that you're not going to talk to CDRH compliance oversight staff and pre-market review staff. Instead, you're going to talk to OHT staff, organized principally by product area, with responsibility for pre-market and post-market activities. Sometimes you'll talk to the staff about submissions for new devices, and sometimes you'll talk to this staff about regulatory compliance concerns. Unlike other FDA medical product centers, it's the same staff for pre-market and post-market topics. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about who at FDA regulates medical devices. And as I mentioned before, a big part of that answer is the Center for Devices, but it's not exclusively the Center for Devices. There's another key player that we also need to account for, which is the Office of Regulatory Affairs, ORA. So what is ORA? It's a different FDA component, as I mentioned earlier. And as I mentioned earlier, it's part of the Commissioner's Office, not the Center for Devices. ORA is responsible for all of FDA's field activities for devices, drugs, biologics, and even foods. So, for example, when FDA inspects a device facility or begins a product recall, that's handled by ORA. It's ORA staff conducting the inspection or talking with a device firm about the product recall, for example. ORA coordinates with the Center for Devices on these matters. So that you might imagine, for example, that ORA sends a device firm a warning about manufacturing quality failures, and then decides that the firm hasn't adequately addressed those concerns. ORA may recommend legal action against the firm, like seizure of its products. That seizure recommendation goes to the Device Center for review and approval. Or if there's a product recall, ORA will coordinate recall management activities with CDRH, the Devices Center. So what does this mean for you? Pay attention to who you're talking to. Are you dealing with ORA on inspection findings, for example, or are you dealing with CDRH for pre-market product review? And answers to these kinds of questions can dictate your strategy. The device center, CDRH, tends to be more engaged with stakeholders like companies and willing to consider alternate approaches to meeting regulatory requirements, even when those approaches are identified by parties outside FDA. By contrast, ORA tends to be a bit more quote unquote by the books. It applies regulatory requirements literally based on written, published standards and established past practice. There's really very little room for creative approaches, even when those approaches describe a better way to meet regulatory requirements. So in developing effective regulatory strategies, it's critical to consider who at FDA you're talking to. And this includes whether that party has sole decision-making authority or whether there will be review by other agency components that may be willing to discuss ultimate strategies. Let's go to the next slide. I want to turn to what FDA engagement means. And a good place to start is the simple question, what do we mean by effective FDA engagement? This slide contains a working definition that proposes informed, trust-based exchanges to promote timely and appropriate discussions. So first, let's talk about informed. This puts the onus on you, the external stakeholder, to come to FDA educated about the issues for discussion. Firms lose credibility and FDA staff patience when they don't understand the underlying substantive issues and basic regulatory practice. For example, if FDA questions a firm's supply chain oversight, that firm should start the discussion knowing what the relevant regulatory requirements are. How do those requirements apply to the firm's operation? Can it gain insights from relevant FDA guidance documents or other publications? Taking the time to master such factors builds credibility. It shows FDA that you understand the regulatory and operational landscape, and this will strengthen arguments that you raise about how FDA practices and procedures should be modified or applied to your firm to accommodate operations. Next, let's talk about trust-based engagement. Trust is the quote-unquote secret sauce. It separates effective engagement from unsuccessful interaction. What do I mean by trust-based? Trust comes from showing FDA staff that you are credible and reliable. Staff doesn't have to worry about whether your statement of facts, regulatory provisions, past actions, and similar factors are accurate and relevant. This reliability streamlines discussions by eliminating questions about whether your representations are valid. As critical, trust takes time. You create trust by showing consistently and repeatedly that you're an honest broker. That conclusion isn't the result of a one-time exchange. It builds over time when FDA staff sees you consistently providing accurate and reliable information. Trust also means that you're timely. This is just good business practice, so I won't waste your time by telling you what you already know. When you provide FDA information, deliver it promptly. If you need more time, explain that to staff. Tell staff why you need more time and when the relevant information will be delivered, and then meet that commitment. Lastly, effective FDA engagement is appropriate. You are not seeking special treatment or non-public information. You are asking FDA to act as it might towards any similarly situated company, or you're proposing a generally applicable regulatory interpretation. Consider whether what you're requesting could create the appearance of favoritism. If yes, then recraft your request to assure an even playing field. Similarly, if you have an open 510(k) application or FDA has raised product label concerns, factors like those will affect and limit what FDA can say. Definitely in such situations, there's value in making your points to FDA, but the agency will be more reticent in its communication than interactions without background regulatory issues. Let's go on to the next slide. I'd like to raise for a moment what effective regulatory engagement is not. First, no surprise, it's not friendship, which is to say you're not looking to become friends with FDA regulators. Now, friendships do often form between FDA staff and industry members, and when that happens, fantastic. But those friendships are not a prerequisite to effective regulator engagement. Rather, what you seek is good engagement, which is to say that FDA sees you as a credible resource with valuable and reliable information. Likewise, you want confidence in the reliability and accuracy of information provided by FDA. You also want confidence that when you ask questions or suggest alternate regulatory approaches, FDA staff will answer your questions and consider your requests on the merits. Effective engagement is not access to non-public information. And there's no need to belabor this point. I'll just say, don't ask for this information. Likewise, you're not looking for special treatment. FDA has standard frameworks for engaging with stakeholders. You're simply using such tools to work collaboratively, efficiently, and productively with agency staff. Let's go on to the next slide. Why do we even care about effective FDA engagement? And the answer is that effective engagement offers opportunities both to influence FDA initiatives and to introduce ideas and proposals for FDA consideration. I'll begin by talking about influencing FDA initiatives. Engaging FDA staff provides chances to talk about FDA programs and priorities. Why is FDA taking on an initiative? What does the agency hope to accomplish? Are there opportunities for stakeholder input? At the same time, this engagement allows stakeholders to suggest initiatives that may be important but unknown to FDA. Effective engagement supports two-way communication between FDA and stakeholders. Sometimes that communication allows changes to FDA practices and policies. Other times, this engagement allows companies to figure out just what the heck FDA is looking for. There's a value in understanding FDA priorities and what's needed to satisfy those priorities. And when industry proposes a modification to FDA practices or priorities, effective engagement supports those proposals. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's talk about how to effectively engage FDA. What should companies do to build successful relationships with FDA staff? There are 4 factors to keep in mind. The first factor is credibility. You must be credible as you engage FDA, and you want FDA staff to see this credibility. This means giving accurate and reliable information, meeting your commitments, knowing what to discuss with FDA and what not to discuss, and as mentioned earlier, not seeking special treatment. Next, know your issues and your asks. This includes understanding things like regulatory principles, agency actions and precedents, and congressional and public positions on the points under consideration. As important, know what you're asking FDA to do. This means a clear and concise statement of what you're seeking, whether that's confirming a regulatory interpretation or adopting a new regulatory approach. Next, match your asks to FDA priorities and actions. You want to align what you're asking FDA to do with what the agency thinks it should do or is thinking about what it should do. And then if there's misalignment, just understand that's not fatal, but in those cases, you need to clarify how what you're seeking better meets FDA priorities than the current situation that you're proposing to change. Lastly, document your agreements. And there's no mystery here. It's just good business practice. If FDA explains regulatory requirements or agrees to new ways to meet those requirements, write down what you and FDA agreed to. Then send this documentation to FDA and confirm that you understand the agency's position. I recommend taking such steps even when FDA is responsible for formal meeting minutes. You want to know right away if there's misalignment between you and FDA, and if so, how to bridge any gaps. The next 2 points are tactical, but they're no less important than the ones that we've already covered. First, engage the right FDA component. Which part of FDA has responsibility and authority for the topic that you're raising? If you're talking about a drug, for example, it's logical to engage FDA's drug center. But what if this engagement covers topics outside the drug center's purview, like congressional oversight, which is a topic typically handled by the FDA Commissioner's Office? In such cases, you may need to include other responsible FDA components like representation from the Commissioner's Office. Finally, figure out the right FDA engagement level. Some firms believe that anytime you engage FDA, you need senior staff. I disagree with that position. Who to engage is context specific. Definitely for policy discussions or broad initiatives, it makes sense to engage senior leaders, but there are other times, like when you're trying to get answers about established procedure, where senior engagement is just overkill. In those more narrow cases, go to staff with direct responsibility for those procedures. Often that staff will best understand the questions that you're asking and then provide useful on-point responses. Let's go to the next slide. Next, I want to walk through a list of bad engagement practices, and things that you just should not do. And so I'm going to start with bad practices. First, don't over communicate with FDA. And this can be a bit paradoxical. What I mean is this: FDA staff is incredibly busy, and between the pandemic, user fee negotiations, and the Zoom craze, that problem has only gotten worse. This makes time a valuable commodity. So be judicious when you ask for FDA staff's time. This means how often you ask for time and how much time you ask for. If you can, keep your interactions to a half an hour. And for very complex issues or topics with lots of moving parts, you can extend your conversations to an hour, but that should be the exception, not the rule. The next point is self-evident. Don't be discourteous. This is just good business practice. Even impressions within FDA form quickly. They last and they're circulated. Last, don't expect absolute answers to your questions. You're trying to get the best information you can based on FDA staff's understanding of the facts and principles at hand, informed by your input. These are dynamic components that may change, sometimes producing different responses. So expect FDA to hedge its responses. For example, given our understanding of the information you've provided, this is what we think the answer is. Not getting a fixed and firm answer is not a cause for concern. In my experience, if the information that you provide does not materially change, neither will FDA's response. There are some things that you should just never do, period. Never ask FDA to modify its core principles, things like product safety and efficacy requirements or requirements for quality manufacturing practices. If you want to propose ways to better meet those requirements, fine. But FDA will not eliminate those requirements, and you will look inexperienced and unreliable for making that request. Likewise, don't ask for non-public information or preferential treatment. We've talked about these points before, so I won't belabor them here. Let's just go to the next slide. Instead, let's talk about innovation and how it affects FDA engagement. By innovation, I mean product innovation, as well as regulatory innovation or similar new approaches to established practice. No surprise, innovation changes the rules of effective engagement. Standard practices don't apply in exactly the same way. What's interesting, though, is that innovation often creates good engagement opportunities. When innovating, FDA knows that it may not have the best solutions, so the agency solicits stakeholders like industry to find the best options. Sitting at the discussion table helps inform FDA decisions. Who sits at the table often results from who FDA sees as thought leaders and subject matter experts. But even during innovation discussions, core engagement principles apply. Those principles are listed on this slide, and we've talked about them, and so I'm not going to repeat them here. Let's just go ahead to the next slide. Let me wrap up this section with a number of key principles to remember. First, mistakes happen. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, you know that it's true. If you make a mistake, own it. Tell FDA that you realize that you've made a mistake and you know how to fix it, and then go ahead and fix your mistake. The accountability and honesty that FDA perceives coming from you is going to increase your credibility and FDA's willingness to engage you. Sometimes there's no mistake. You have a legitimate position, and FDA does too, but they're misaligned. Don't respond by playing push me, pull you. Instead, look for another approach that gives FDA what it wants and that is still acceptable to you. Bank the resulting goodwill and use it for another day. I make the next point, don't get angry, only somewhat satirically. There are times where it is totally appropriate and advantageous to get angry. But when that happens, be strategic and professional. No belligerence, no personal attacks, and obviously no profanity. Use anger to signal how strongly you feel about your position, how frustrated you are with FDA's response, and similar critically important points. And in any event, keep this anger option in your quiver for as long as possible and use it when appropriate as a last resort. Finally, don't be afraid to escalate. If you and FDA staff are stuck, and bringing in senior FDA staff will help you get unstuck, engage that senior staff. There are best practices for doing this, which I'll review. But first, let me address an industry misperception that I've come across, frankly, more times than I can count. Companies admit we won't escalate because we don't want to alienate FDA staff. And again, I think that this perspective is dead wrong. I worked for more than 13 years at FDA, and during the entire time that I was there, I never heard of a single instance where a company was penalized for elevating a concern. To the contrary, FDA managers rely on companies as an information source to tell them when the staff that they manage is mistaken. Oftentimes, managers just don't have visibility to those situations, but they want to know when they happen. As I mentioned, though, there are steps to take to elevate issues productively. There's a playbook. And so what is that playbook? And in response, I'll say it's not complicated. Begin by telling the FDA counterparts that you're working with that this issue, this situation is one where you believe that manager engagement would be helpful. And then, of course, include that FDA staff as you reach out to managers. So you want to copy that staff on correspondence, include them in meetings, et cetera. And when elevating, respect the chain of command. This means don't go immediately to the center director from the jump. Figure out who the FDA lead's direct supervisor is. Go to that person. And if that elevation fails, you have the option to consider whether it makes sense to move further up the review chain. It's a strategic choice. So I won't say that that makes sense in all instances, but there may be some instances where even when you have elevated an answer and you are not getting the response that you believe is accurate, you can choose to go further up the review chain. So let's go to the next slide. What do you do when regulatory engagement goes wrong? By this, I mean when, despite your best efforts, things deteriorate. A bad inspection leads to a warning letter, for example, or a series of bad inspections leads to an FDA injunction action. It's critical in these cases not to give up. There are still opportunities to shape regulatory exchanges with FDA in ways that benefit you. To illustrate this, I'll focus on two scenarios. The first is regulatory correspondence from FDA, such as warning or untitled letters. The second is FDA civil enforcement action, which most often means product seizure or injunction suits. I'll also mention that FDA has criminal enforcement authority, but criminal actions are unusual except in extreme circumstances, and those situations really are outside the scope of today's discussion. Let's go to the next slide. Let's start by discussing some terms. I'll begin with warning letters because they're FDA's predominant way of communicating regulatory expectations and violations. So what is a warning letter? It's correspondence from FDA to an entity, typically a business or an individual, that the agency regulates. When FDA finds through inspection or other means that the entity has violated regulatory requirements, FDA sends the warning letter to notify the entity of the violations. As important is what a warning letter is not. It's not enforcement action. This is critical, so I'm going to just mention it one more time. Warning letters and untitled letters, for that matter, are not enforcement action. Rather, FDA considers warning letters to be informal and advisory. They communicate FDA's position, but they do not commit the agency to enforcement. Still, parties that receive warning letters can't just ignore them. FDA expects these parties to fix the problems that FDA finds. FDA expects not only that warning letter recipients will correct the violations, but also that they will confirm the fixes in writing, usually within 15 working days from the warning letter date. FDA then verifies the corrections, often through follow-up inspections. And entities that fail to adequately fix warning letter citations can face escalated FDA actions like product seizures and injunctions without prior FDA notice. Also, some medical product centers, and FDA's device center is one of them, will refuse marketing applications for products made at facilities with manufacturing quality deficiencies. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's talk for a moment about FDA untitled letters. First off, what does untitled letter mean? As I mentioned earlier, this is FDA correspondence, not enforcement action. And untitled letter is a broad term that encompasses a wide range of correspondence. For our purposes, I'm referencing an FDA letter that cites regulatory violations that don't rise to the level of seriousness that would justify a warning letter, but that FDA nonetheless brings to an individual's or a company's attention. Unlike warning letters, untitled letters don't state that failure to take prompt corrective action will result in agency enforcement. Untitled letters also do not require FDA follow-up, and FDA will not deny product approvals based on an untitled letter. Still, if you receive an untitled letter, don't ignore it. Failure to address deficiencies in an untitled letter eventually could lead to a warning letter or agency enforcement. The better practice is to fix the problems identified by FDA or contact FDA if you think that the agency is wrong. And we'll talk in a moment about what that communication looks like. For now, let's just go on to the next slide. I want to pivot and talk about formal FDA enforcement action, which typically involves agency lawyers and court proceedings. That means more time, greater cost, and complexity. So we're going to start with product seizures. No surprise, the question that comes to mind is, what exactly is a product seizure? Importantly, this is an action against an FDA-regulated product, like a drug or a medical device. FDA brings a seizure action against the product because the agency believes that the product violates the laws that it enforces. And this is a civil judicial action, not a criminal case. So what does a seizure look like? Typically, FDA and the US Marshals, which are law enforcement representatives who work for the federal government, show up at a manufacturing or distribution site to execute the seizure, inform managers that the product is being seized, and either rope off the product, for example, or physically remove it from the site. Once a product is seized, there are three options. First, a company that has had products seized can choose to do nothing. That is, if no one claims an interest in the seized product and contests the seizure, then FDA can simply proceed with destroying the product, in which case FDA bears the costs of the seizure and destruction of the product. Second, a party can claim an interest in the seized product and work with FDA to repair it. If the party is successful, then FDA releases the product and it can be sold. Last, a party can litigate. This means that the party claims an interest in the product and claims that the product meets legal and regulatory requirements. A judge then decides if the party or FDA is right and whether the product can be sold or it should be destroyed. Again, all of these results affect the seized product, not individuals. So seizures are different than injunction actions, which affect individual behavior and action. And we're going to talk about injunctions next. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Injunctions are best described as the 600-pound gorilla of FDA enforcement action. They're relatively rare, but they're very high profile, and they can have a huge impact, not just on the target, but on the whole business sector. And this is because when FDA brings an injunction action, firms in that market space pay attention. Let's talk about what an injunction action is. Like seizures, injunctions are civil judicial proceedings. Unlike seizures, injunctions don't target property. Rather, they charge individuals or firms with violations of FDA regulatory requirements. For example, FDA may bring an injunction action against a firm for repeat violations of quality manufacturing requirements. Still, the remedies that FDA seeks often affect the product that a firm makes. For example, FDA may require a firm to stop manufacturing products and not resume operations at a particular facility until all of the regulatory violations at that facility are corrected. In terms of resolution, injunctions typically follow one of two paths. First, the injunction target can challenge the injunction, arguing that FDA's factual or legal claims are incorrect. Those challenges can go all the way to a full-blown court case. Second, but much more often, injunctions are settled through consent decrees. These are negotiated agreements between FDA and the firm that FDA charges. Consent decrees can be comprehensive and long-lasting, and they impose heavy requirements on the parties charged by FDA. Let's go on to the next slide. So that basically represents the basics, the regulatory correspondent and enforcement actions that often impair positive FDA engagement. This in turn begs the question, what do you do? When you're facing a warning or untitled letter, or you're named in an FDA injunction action, how do you maintain or rebuild positive FDA engagement? And the answer in part depends on which action we're talking about. What you can and should do is different for regulatory correspondence like warning and untitled letters, as opposed to FDA enforcement action. We'll begin with regulatory correspondence. First, as we've discussed, you have to know who you're dealing with at FDA. Different parts of the agency have different practices and expectations, and those factors influence how you engage. So to see this, we'll talk momentarily about the Office of Regulatory Affairs. Among that office's many responsibilities, ORA staff members assess medical product facilities, including to decide if those facilities satisfy quality manufacturing requirements. As a result, it just doesn't make sense to ask these staff members to consider innovative regulatory processes like streamlined quality requirements for novel products, whether they're digital products, real-world evidence, things like that. These types of discussions are the domain of FDA's medical product centers, like the device and drug centers, which lead regulatory strategy for their respective products. By contrast, a company challenging inspection results should direct its arguments to the ORA office that conducted the inspection. That office is going to have primary responsibility for the facility inspection and assessing whether or not violations identified as a result of those inspections are valid. But here's an equally important question. Ask yourselves whether you need to engage at all. Standard FDA practice doesn't include a lot of back and forth between companies and agency staff following inspections. Communication in these situations, it just may be the wrong way to go. That type of communication requires time from FDA, and as we've discussed, time is a precious commodity. So ask whether your topic is very important and whether regulatory engagement is critical to resolve it. If not, then you may want to defer communication and keep your powder dry for another day. Let's go to the next slide. Sometimes, however, engagement is necessary. Let's talk about those situations, starting with general information requests and continuing to regulatory correspondence, meaning FDA warning and untitled letters. The first point is simple. Sometimes you just need information. Companies that get letters from FDA invest time, effort, and money to understand the problems that FDA has identified and the solutions that it's looking for. Often, these companies can figure out FDA expectations based on the plain language of the regulatory correspondence. But sometimes regulatory correspondence is confusing, leaving companies to guess at FDA's meaning. Guessing is okay as a starting point, but it's not enough. Those guesses need to be tested, revised, and confirmed through regulatory engagement. Now we'll turn to regulatory correspondence like warning and untitled letters. Remember that for warning letters, FDA requires a written response that details the actions taken and planned to remedy the cited violations. And while untitled letters may not compel a written response, it's smart to provide this response with the same kinds of information. Doing so demonstrates to FDA that you take the untitled letter seriously, and that action may help shape decisions that the agency makes by way of follow-on. As important, if you disagree with FDA, then it's essential to provide a detailed written explanation of your disagreement. That explanation will become a touchstone as FDA evaluates your assertion that the agency is off base. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's pivot and talk a moment about simple blocking and tackling strategies. How do you best handle regulatory outreach? First, start in writing. Acknowledge that you've received the FDA correspondence. Tell the agency what you're looking for, whether that's more information, clarification of FDA's position, input on remediation plans, discussion of disagreements or other topics, and explain why accommodating these requests is in the agency's best interest. This written document then becomes the framework for future communications, whether they're verbal or in writing. You're reducing the risk of confusion about why you're engaging FDA, and if confusion creeps in, you can return to the written document to restate the reasons for engaging, what you hope to accomplish, and what you offer FDA. Also, make sure that you're talking to the right FDA component. This includes whoever sent you the correspondence, but find out and include other interested FDA parties. For example, if you're responding to a warning letter from the Center for Drugs, does that letter stem from an inspection conducted by an FDA field office? If so, copy the field office on your correspondence and consider whether there are other FDA components with stakes in the topics under discussion. If that's the case, you want to include these other entities as well in your correspondence. Still, notwithstanding these factors, you may think that FDA is wrong, and that's fine. In those cases, explain to FDA respectfully why you think that it's wrong and what the right answer is. Provide documents and other evidence that supports your position. FDA probably won't argue the merits with you in real time, but staff may ask questions, and that's another chance to provide persuasive information. And if FDA is interested in substantive discussion, then engage. Share your concerns, listen to and adjust for FDA responses, and decide on next steps. Sometimes those steps will be a compromise. Other times you won't gain ground, even if you've convinced yourselves that FDA is dead wrong. In those cases, you can then decide whether to elevate the disagreement to a higher level. And that depends on the facts and regulatory issues of the matter that you're dealing with. At the end of the day, those are the kinds of factors that should guide your decision and allow you to assess whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Even when you don't get what you want, however, you're still getting positive regulatory engagement. Odds are you're a repeat FDA customer, and you want to be known as someone who can credibly navigate disagreements. This means that even if FDA decides against you, there's never any question about your honesty, accuracy, and reliability. Let's go on to the next slide. What if you're dealing with FDA enforcement action, like product seizures or injunctions? No question, enforcement actions change the rules of engagement, but some principles do stay the same. For example, let's start with written correspondence. That's where you want to begin. Your objective is a fixed record of your position, what you're asking of FDA, and what you're offering. Also, know who you're talking to. Are you engaging product center staff, lawyers from FDA's Office of Chief Counsel, or Department of Justice litigators, for example? Answering these questions influences the specificity of discussions and similar substantive and contextual assessments. Last, proceed carefully. You should always be careful in FDA communications, but the stakes here are especially high. Outcomes affect your business structure, costs, reputation, and product pipeline. Further, understand that your engagement opportunities and pathways may be more limited. That is, formal FDA enforcement is structured with set approaches to when and how engagement occurs. As important, FDA likely will want its lawyers involved in all substantive discussions. And you also may decide that there's value in having your lawyers present for discussions and documenting those discussions in writing. All of these strictures are okay. FDA sees them as part of the enforcement playbook, and you should view them the same. Even in this formal context, there's room for positive regulatory engagement. So, of course, follow basic practices like being polite, reading commitments, and showing understanding of FDA's position. And don't be afraid to press FDA if you think that it's wrong or there's a better way to achieve a particular result. Regulatory engagement helps you identify which FDA positions are fixed and which ones are open to discussion. And this, in turn, can produce critical consensus on things like continuing business operations during remediation, timelines for key deliverables, and the need for and content of public communication. Let's move on to the next slide. In this next session, I want to turn to some hot topics that the Center for Devices has been focusing on significantly over the last 1 to 2 years. If you ask, where is CDRH's attention these days, the topics listed here would make up a big part of that answer. Probably these topics are not going to have a huge impact on your day-to-day work with FDA because they're different than the more typical activities like product and facility review that we've been discussing. Also, digital health and real-world evidence are very new and dynamic topics with many unresolved issues and moving parts. And so their applicability to your ordinary practices may be diminished in relation to some of the other things that we've discussed. At the same time, these items are all big deals. So hopefully you'll learn something about them. And then later you can impress your bosses and friends by showing them that you're in the know. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. We'll begin with digital health. And in the device context, this includes products that are purely digital, like software to evaluate body functions, or conventional devices with digital components. It's just hard to overstate the importance of digital technology. It's massive, dominating discussions across FDA, especially in the device center. So how do I know this? One big clue is FDA's launch of its Digital Health Center of Excellence. This is a new center that FDA launched specifically to promote digital innovation and work through related regulatory questions. What's fascinating is that FDA advances this new, critical, and often unresolved area through collaboration with stakeholders. And what I mean is that FDA understands that there are myriad unknowns related to digital health technology. And FDA recognizes that in charting a path forward, it's not always the best, most informed expert. So FDA has engaged other stakeholders, like medical product companies, to talk about which regulatory approaches make sense and where FDA should change its practices to promote innovation while assuring safe and effective medical products. At the end of the day, FDA has the last word in these discussions. It decides where to make changes, where to start new programs, and where to maintain established standards. But in making these choices, FDA is engaging with stakeholders, including drug and device makers, to get the best answers. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's turn to real-world evidence. And in the context of discussing real-world evidence, we'll talk both about real-world evidence and real-world data. I'll begin with some definitions. Real-world data is a broader term than real-world evidence. Real-world data means data relating to patient health or healthcare delivery. This data comes from various sources different than traditional clinical trial data. For example, real-world data can come from sources such as electronic health records, medical claims data, and data from product and disease registries. Real-world evidence is the data about the use and potential benefits or risks of a medical product that is derived from real-world data. So when we talk about real-world evidence, we mean a subset of real-world data that can be used to support things like device approval and modifications. Unlike many of the other topics that we've discussed, real-world evidence has FDA-wide application. This means that multiple FDA product centers, like the Centers for Drugs, Biologics, and Devices, as well as the FDA Commissioner's Office, are considering how best to identify and use real-world evidence. FDA's real-world evidence program includes demonstration projects, stakeholder engagement, and internal processes to solicit and apply senior leadership input. In terms of where things are now, the answer is briefly in flux. Yes, this is a very active topic across FDA, and there are many unresolved issues affecting use of real-world evidence to support product applications. That then raises the question, what does this mean for you? If you are talking to FDA about a product and you think that real-world evidence can inform that discussion, then by all means, make this point. Tell staff about the real-world evidence and how you believe that it can support FDA decision-making. While formal policies are being developed, using real-world evidence in specific cases where it's relevant is fair game. At the same time, standard evidence like clinical trial data isn't going away. And there's sometimes no need to reference or to develop real-world evidence when standard clinical trial data and other types of standard data sources will suffice. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, I want to talk about user fee funding. And this is user fee funding for medical device review, although there are similar mechanisms in place for other medical products like drugs and biologics. Again, this is really background information. It's good to know about this funding, but it's unlikely to affect or significantly influence your day-to-day engagement with FDA. So here's the bottom line. FDA negotiates with industry to get fees to support pre-market review of medical devices. I'll note that these are initiatives that support pre-market review. User fee funding is not used at all to support post-market oversight of medical devices. So the agreements that are put in place run for periods of 5 years, and every 5 years, they are renegotiated. We just went through last year in 2022 one of these 5-year renegotiation cycles. Typically, these fees are referred to as MDUFA agreements. MDUFA stands for Medical Device User Fee Agreements. So essentially, device firms say to FDA, we're going to give you money that you, FDA, may use to support your pre-market operations. And every 5 years, we'll negotiate how much money we'll pay and what you, FDA, commit to do to improve and streamline device pre-market review. And these negotiations include FDA's position, both on where it needs to spend money to improve operations and things that industry is able to do that will have the net effect of improving pre-market device review. So those become collective goals between FDA and industry. One more important point on this topic, these user fees represent the minority of FDA's medical device operating budget. Most of that budget comes from the US Congress, which helps assure that FDA isn't quote unquote captured by industry because it doesn't rely on industry members for all or even the majority of its funding. At the same time, there's just no getting away from the fact that FDA is continuously negotiating or talking about negotiating its funding, both with Congress and with members of industry. So let me pause there. That wraps up my formal presentation.